It is the most elusive treasure of them all, the cup of Christ, used at the Last Supper and imbued with miraculous powers.
It was really the answer to whatever it is you need, the ultimate balm, the ultimate healing thing, the solution to one's problems.
The Holy Grail has bewitched treasure hunters for over a millennium. And Heinrich Himmler, the head of the Nazi SS, would become obsessed with finding it.
Don't underestimate Heinrich Himmler. What he wants, he gets.
He scoured the world in his search and was said to have sent special forces on top-secret missions.
Who better to send on your Grail quest than Otto Skorzeny, the ultimate one-man Nazi fighting machine?
And he placed the resources of the SS in the hands of Germany's foremost Grail hunter.
Otto Rahn was really the real Indiana Jones,
who would eventually give his life in the ultimate Nazi treasure hunt. This is the story of Himmler's quest for the Holy Grail. Berlin, 1933. The Nazis are in full control of Germany. Otto Rahn, a young cash-strapped writer, is heading to a meeting. He is answering a mysterious telegram. An anonymous benefactor has offered Rahn 1,000 Reichmarks a month, a very impressive wage, to write a book. The meeting is at 7 Prince Albertstrasse. Rahn has no idea who will be waiting for him.
He goes there, and who should he see but Heinrich Himmler himself.
Reichsfuhrer Heinrich Himmler was the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany, second only to Adolf Hitler. Himmler was the head of the SS, a fearsome paramilitary organization which controlled much of the Nazi state. He charged Rahn with a remarkable, almost unbelievable mission: to find the Holy Grail. The Holy Grail is the most sought-after treasure in history.
The Holy Grail is the cup of the Last Supper, the cup of Christ, that is meant to have been used to celebrate the First Communion.
It is commonly believed that the same cup was used by the disciple, Joseph of Arimathea, to catch the blood of Christ whilst he was nailed to the cross. But other legends say it is even older than that the Grail was used by Abraham, the founding patriarch of the Jewish people.
There are other people, of course, who think that it's the cup of Abraham. And this cup apparently became part of the sacred treasure of the Jews and was carried around with the Ark of the Covenant.
Over the years, the legend of the Grail has grown and been embellished. Sometimes it is said to be a stone or a plate, but most commonly, it is a chalice. Whatever it is, all the legends agree that the Grail possesses miraculous powers. For the Grail is supposed to provide its holder with eternal life.
The Grail is really the answer to whatever it is you need, the thing that will fill you up when you're empty, that will heal you when you're wounded. It's kind of the ultimate balm, the ultimate healing thing, the solution to one's problems.
Such is its mystique. The Grail has obsessed treasure hunters for centuries. Tales abound of crusader knights searching for it, whilst they laid waste to lands in the Middle East. And in legend, many of the stories of the mythical King Arthur and his knights concern their quest for the Grail. But despite thousands of years of searching, no one has ever found it. But why would Himmler want such an item? Not only was he a fanatical Nazi, it seems he held some other very unusual beliefs. He was obsessed with mystery, legend, astrology, the occult, and Germany's pagan past.
Himmler fundamentally was, today we would call him a geek. He was the type of guy who was massively into Tolkien. He'd be playing Warhammer every day. He was just a nerd, if you like. I mean, there's no other word to describe him.
Well, Heinrich Himmler was obviously an extremely strange man, but he was in a position of extraordinary power.
Don't underestimate Heinrich Himmler. What he wants, he gets.
Himmler shaped his SS on the traditions of Germany's pre-Christian tribes. He promoted a cult of ancestor worship, and within the SS, Christian festivals would be replaced with pagan holidays. Instead of Christmas and Easter, Himmler had his SS celebrate the winter and spring solstices. Officers were married in SS rituals called Ehrweihe. SS naming ceremonies replaced christenings. It was as if he were attempting to create a new Nazi religion.
By reawakening the old gods and the ancient traditions of their Germanic ancestors, they hoped to create a new order that would dominate Europe for the next 1,000 years.
Even the design of the SS insignia reflected Himmler's obsession with Germany's pagan past. It was two Sieg runes, occult symbols of a long-dead Germanic people.
You've got this creation of a kind of whole mythology which starts to become a real, quote-unquote, religion. You've got all these sort of elements that the Nazis want to include, and if you're trying to create a religion, if you want to look how to do it, well, you should just study Himmler and what he got up to, because in many ways, he was the perfect kind of cult leader. And that's what Nazism became, and that's what the religion behind Nazism became. It was basically a cult.
Himmler's obsession with mysticism led him to focus on one of the greatest legends of all, the legend of the Holy Grail. He selected for his headquarters Wewelsburg Castle in northeast Germany. He installed a round table and a ritual chamber in the basement of the north-facing tower. He named rooms after King Arthur and the Holy Grail. This was to be Himmler's Camelot, a castle for his new knightly order.
He wanted the SS to be a kind of breed of Teutonic knights. And he wanted to blend Arthurian myth with actual present-day, real, mechanized military machine. He wanted to have those same sort of knightly virtues that you read about in Grail legends.
Now he had his castle and his knights. There was one last thing he needed.
Now, what better to have in your knightly Arthurian-style castle than the Grail itself?
And that was why Rahn had been summoned to meet Himmler. Because Rahn was Germany's leading expert on the Holy Grail. Otto Rahn was born in 1904. He grew up during the horrors of the First World War. As an escape, he immersed himself in legends and mythology.
He was enamored by all the myths and legends of the old days, because the present was not so nice. So that he fled back in books and stories, and the stories of Wodan and Donor and all the Nordic stories.
His favorite myth, very popular in Germany, was about one of King Arthur's knights of the Round Table, Percival, known in Germany as Parsifal. The best-known version of the story was written by Wolfgang von Eschenbach in the 13th century. In the tale, a young Parsifal searches for the elusive Grail. In Eschenbach's version, the Grail is not a cup, but a rock.
The Grail is described as a hard, dark stone, which is contained in a reliquary. And Eschenbach says whoever has this stone or is near to it will have eternal life and will be healed.
According to the legend, Parsifal eventually finds the Grail in a mythical castle which Eschenbach calls Münzalbesch. Rahn became captivated with the tale, believing that Münzalbesch was a real place and that the Parsifal story was actually true. He was convinced that by studying it, he could find the castle. And if he could find Münzalbesch, then he would find the Grail. The young Rahn threw himself into researching these myths.
I think Otto became enthused with the idea of actually finding the truth behind these legends. Also, he had a very methodical German mind. He was trying to really back-engineer the myth by finding the historical personages that became the figures in mythology. We can see in his work that there's maps and genealogies.
After years of researching, Rahn eventually discovered a clue. He found it in the songs of the troubadours, the traveling poets of the medieval courts of France.
Otto Rahn rightly decided that the troubadour songs were really the only authentic record of what had happened. That a lot of the written records had been destroyed, but through oral tradition, through the songs and through the legends, echoes of what had really come down still survived into the present day.
In some of these songs, the troubadours sang of a medieval religious sect called the Cathars. The Cathars were said to have owned great treasures, including a sacred relic, a rock that had fallen from heaven. Rahn was sure that this relic must be the Holy Grail, as described by Eschenbach. The Cathars certainly were real. They were a 12th century religious sect, predominantly from the Languedoc region of southwest France.
What we call Catharism is really a variant of Christianity which believed that you needed no intermediaries between man and God, that any individual could have direct communion with the divine, which meant that the entire hierarchy of priests, prelates, cardinals, the entire church was kind of irrelevant, which also bugged Catholicism no end.
The Pope branded the Cathars heretics, and a vicious crusade was launched against them.
And this religious group of people were hunted down by the Roman Catholic Church because they opposed the Roman Catholic Church.
Across southern France, the Cathars were slaughtered in their thousands by the forces of the Pope. The last remaining Cathars were besieged in a mountain fortress called Montségur.
Montségur was the place where the Cathars held their last stand in 1244. This is when the armies surrounded the castle for 10 months.
Eventually, the odds were just too much for them, 10,000 against approximately 300 fighting men. After a 16-day truce, the surviving Cathars under their last priest, Bertrand Marty, were chained by the hands and the neck and dragged down the mountain at dawn, hanging them, cutting their throats as a way of destroying the faith once and for all.
And finally, after they surrendered, 200 Cathars were burned at the stake. So it is gone into history as the last stand of the Cathars.
All of this was verifiable fact. But if, as Rahn believed, the stories of the troubadours were also true, what had happened to the Cathar treasure and the Holy Grail?
When the Crusaders entered the castle, there was no trace of the mythical treasure, the infinite amounts of money they had expected. And over the years, various legends and rumors have accrued around what actually happened to the treasure of the Cathars, the treasures of the faith.
Rahn uncovered local stories which said that the Cathars had managed to smuggle their treasure out of the castle before it fell.
There was a very enduring story, a myth perhaps, that there were 4 of the Cathars who were hidden in the castle against the terms of the ceasefire, who apparently escaped the night before the burning, carrying with them the legendary Holy Grail. People started to believe that it had been smuggled out.
The escaping Cathars, according to this legend, then hid the Grail somewhere in the network of caves and caverns which run for miles throughout the mountains. Rahn became convinced that the legend was true and that the Grail had to be hidden at Montségur.
I can see Rahn's thinking in that he thought that these really were the places described in the original myth. And he was certainly very, very enthused and excited by what he had found.
Otto was quite sure that he had to find the Grail here, that this must have been the place where they hid it.
Even before being summoned by Himmler, Rahn had traveled to Montségur, a beautiful, remote area of the French Pyrenees. He was sure that the Grail could be found in the uncharted mountains of this region. He spent years exploring the area.
All these places were completely off the map at that point. No one knew about this history or about the existence of the caves or the castles.
The work was difficult and treacherous, but undeterred, Rahn sunk more and more of his money into the quest.
Where he took over the lease on a small hotel, which was really a front for his continued explorations of the area. He started to really methodically work his way through all the cave systems. Certainly had his work cut out. It's the largest limestone district in Europe. And he wasn't a trained archaeologist. In fact, he was a trained etymologist. But he certainly got his hands dirty.
Otto Rahn was really the real Indiana Jones. He was out there. He was into the woods. He was climbing caves. He was climbing castles. He was searching for relics and searching for treasure.
Eventually, he had a breakthrough. Deep in the caves, he found childlike engravings, which he copied in his notebook. In a cavern known as the Bethlehem Grotto, he discovered a strange pentagonal depression carved into the wall. He believed that Cathars once stood in the pentagram when they were being initiated into the order. Rahn also uncovered human skeletons in the caves, which he believed were Cathar remains. To Rahn, this was solid evidence that the Cathars had brought the Grail here. If he could only explore deeper into the caves, Rahn was sure that he would eventually find it. But after years of expensive explorations, Rahn ran out of money.
Otto left France under something of a cloud. He was unable to make the payments on the hotel he'd taken over, and he hadn't been able to pay his staff, and there were in fact legal proceedings against him.
When he returned to Germany, all he had to show for his efforts were notes for a book. But unknown to Rahn, a copy of his book would fall into the hands of the one man in Germany who had both the resources and the will to relaunch his expedition. Heinrich Himmler.
Before the Nazis came to power, people like Otto Rahn were, these kind of weedy, inconsequential figures. They're obsessed with finding the Holy Grail. This was something no one really took seriously. But then suddenly you get this whole new regime that takes these things extremely seriously.
Rahn had never shown any interest in the politics of the Nazis. But now Heinrich Himmler would provide a solution to the biggest problem he faced in his quest for the Grail. Because he offered Rahn the one thing he needed: money.
He was told that the SS would take over funding his research, that they'd give him all the money he needed to continue his search. The only catch being you'd have to wear a black uniform and report to his superiors.
Rahn now found himself in the SS, an organization recruited from the Aryan elite of Nazi Germany. Its members were required to prove their ethnic purity and trace their German bloodline often as far back as the 18th century. It ran some of the most intimidating branches of the Nazi state, including concentration camps and the secret police. Despite this, Rahn seemed to have no concerns about joining.
When you don't have any money and somebody offers you 1,000 Reichsmarks a month, and the only thing you have to do that is to join the SS. And you could have a carte blanche, you could go anywhere in Europe and do your hobby. Otto's hobby was to research. So he said, yeah, I'll take the money, I'll go find, treasures and stuff. Why not?
In 1936, on Himmler's orders, Unterscharführer Rahn joined one of the strangest and most unusual outfits in the SS, a unit entirely staffed by academics. It was called the Ahnenerbe.
If you want the classic example of how the Nazis manipulated intellectualism and academic behavior, you can go no further than look at the Ahnenerbe. This was an institution set up ultimately by Himmler to research, quote-unquote, German ancestry. And it was to look at how you could construct a mythology of Aryanism and Germanic culture.
Himmler believed the Germans were a master race, set aside from all others by their nobility and purity. The Ahnenerbe's task was to provide intellectual proof for this claim.
The Ahnenerbe is very much Himmler's baby. These are his academics, these are his scientists, these are his historians, these are his archaeologists, and they're there ultimately to do one thing, to prove that Himmler's right. Unfortunately, he's completely wrong.
As an academic, joining the Ahnenerbe was the equivalent of selling your soul, because to be a member, you would be asked to prove things that were not true. For example, Himmler even wanted the Ahnenerbe to prove that Jesus was not Jewish.
They were creating their own Bible, an Aryan Bible, a Bible in which Jesus was an Aryan.
The Ahnenerbe claimed that Jesus was part of a tribal group which was not Semitic, but Aryan.
Difficult to believe that you could take Judaism out of the Bible, but that's what the Nazis were doing, and they literally did it. They created an Aryan Bible.
Although it might seem ridiculous, the work of the Ahnenerbe was not harmless.
One's got to be very, very careful not just to write off the Ahnenerbe as a bunch of harmless cranks. No, these people are willingly subverting their own knowledge, their own academic excellence in order to prove something that will later be used to murder people.
But for the moment, Rahn turned a blind eye. In return, he got lavishly funded in his quest for the Grail. With Himmler's backing, Rahn threw himself into his research with renewed vigor and soon published a second book, Lucifer's Court. It was based on new research and on his earlier explorations of the caves around Montségur, where he was convinced the Cathars had hidden the Grail. Himmler was impressed with Rahn's progress. On Reichsführer's order, 5,000 copies of Rahn's book were bound in the finest leather and distributed to the Nazi elite.
Otto's books, first Crusade Against the Grail and his sequel, Court of Lucifer, rapidly became compulsory reading at a certain level of promotion within the SS. If you rose above a certain rank, you were required to read Rahn, and I bet a lot of people really cursed at the idea of having to plow through that material.
With Himmler's backing, Rahn swiftly rose through the ranks of the SS, even though he was not typical SS material.
He was a scholar, an academic, a writer, a poet, and not a warrior. He was a terrible soldier. He was not a great physical specimen. He smoked too much. He was he wasn't very useful on the exercise ground. He was very poor with a gun. He was still promoted very rapidly and ended up as an Obergruppenführer.
But his new power and riches came at a terrible cost to his integrity. Reading proofs of his new book, Rahn discovered that someone had inserted anti-Semitic passages. Rahn chose to ignore this. Still, his only interest was in finding the Grail.
It was a devil's deal that I think he was perhaps too quick to pick up on.
Himmler would now send Rahn all over Europe to find the Grail.
Rahn is dispatched to any number of locations. There's a lot of letters from the time where Otto's asking permission to visit various sites and excavate various sites, and it's just literally lists of place names.
He visited Europe's most famous pagan sites. He conducted excavations and visited pre-Christian monuments around the continent, including the Exensteiner, a towering rock formation in northwestern Germany where ancient Germanic tribes had worshipped for centuries. Himmler even dispatched Rahn as far as Iceland at the head of an SS expedition searching for the Grail. But despite a worldwide quest lasting over 2 years, Rahn couldn't find it.
The fact that he couldn't find the physical Grail made him very nervous, because he couldn't really please Himmler the way he wanted to please him.
Little by little, Rahn began to lose Himmler's confidence.
There's an increasing desperation in the way that Otto attempted to safeguard his position. He was desperate to try and come up with some kind of material evidence for Himmler, to try and show that he was actually of value to the Nazi party after all.
And when Rahn returned from one of his trips, he began to see the SS for what it really was. A terrifying force that oppressed and brutalized its victims.
Really, it became a kind of a state within a state, almost like a parallel form of the police force of the army.
Otto was away a lot, so he didn't really see it much. And when he did come home in Germany, he noticed the change, he noticed the difference.
Suddenly it had become clear to Rahn the danger he was in for failing to find the Grail.
I think he realized his days were numbered.
He started to drink, he started to smoke.
A general sense of panic seems to have set in. Things began to fall apart.
Rahn desperately hoped that Heinrich Himmler would give him more time. But Himmler had run out of patience. In 1937, Himmler stripped Rahn of his rank. Rahn was sent to act as a guard at the notorious Dachau and Buchenwald concentration camps. The concentration camps were built by the Nazis to imprison political and social undesirables. At that time, inmates in Buchenwald included socialists, communists, gypsies, Jehovah's Witnesses, and homosexuals, who were herded into inhuman conditions.
He saw people being hurt, beaten up, murdered. He wanted to get out of there quick. He didn't want to have anything to do with it. He wanted to flee. He wanted to go somewhere else, live somewhere else. He asked several times to live here in France, but it was denied. He didn't really want to be part of the Germany that it had become.
He wrote to a friend,
I have much sorrow in my country. Impossible for a tolerant, liberal man like me to live in a nation that my native country has become.
He was scared out of his senses.
there was a particular reason that what Rahn had seen at Buchenwald filled him with terror. Because he was hiding a dangerous secret. He was himself homosexual.
He had covered this up from the SS from the very beginning because obviously homosexuality, just like being Jewish, was something which would get one sent to the camps. Certainly a lot of people died for the same reasons.
And there was something even worse. Rahn wasn't a pure-blooded Aryan. He was Jewish.
He had Jewish roots through his mother, Clara, which succeeded in covering up for quite a long period of time.
As a member of the SS, Rahn was required to prove he was of pure Aryan descent. It was something he had been deliberately avoiding.
There's also the matter of his Ahnenpass, the certificate of racial purity that he was meant to fill out, which he never submitted.
An Ahnenpass needed to show 4 generations of a pure German bloodline. For Rahn to have submitted his would have been tantamount to suicide. He had hoped that if he could find the Grail, then no one would be concerned about his Ahnenpass. But he had failed to find it. And in 1939, his luck finally ran out.
People found out that his parents, especially his mother, was Jewish. And it was obvious that he was gay. There were so many people saying it, proving it to his superiors.
A gay Jewish SS officer could not survive long in Nazi Germany. Coupled with his failure to find the Grail, Rahn's options were narrowing.
Plainly, Otto's position within the SS became untenable. He must have realized that it was suicidal to stay.
In March 1939, Rahn traveled to the German-Austrian border. High in the snow-covered Alps, he headed out into the mountains. Here, winter temperatures sit well below freezing. Rahn took with him only a bottle of whiskey and some sleeping pills.
It is interesting that it was very close to the 16th of March, to the anniversary of the fall of the Chateau of Montsegur and the burning of the Cathar martyrs. Maybe he chose that date deliberately.
I think he chose the Endura, the death of the Cathars, to sit in the forest, in the middle of the forest on a mountain slope with a magnificent view. Took a couple of bottles of sleeping tablets, knowing that he wouldn't wake up because he would freeze to death that night.
A notice in a Nazi newspaper reported it as a tragic death of an outstanding SS officer and scientist. In 1939, Europe descended into war. Himmler's SS were in the thick of the fighting. But even so, the Reichsfuhrer continued his search for the Grail throughout the war.
Yeah, one might readily have assumed that the death of their Parsifal, their lead Grail hunter, might have closed down the whole program. But this wasn't entirely the end of Himmler's interest in the occult and the archaeological oddities of the past.
In 1940, Himmler accompanied Hitler on a mission to Barcelona to convince Spanish dictator General Franco to bring Spain into the war. But Himmler had an ulterior motive for traveling with the Führer to Spain. He had a new lead for the Grail. It took Himmler to Montserrat Abbey in the Pyrenean Mountains, an hour from Barcelona. An abbey built on the foundations of an ancient castle. The SS had uncovered an age-old Catalonian folk song about a grail-like mystical font of life at that castle. Himmler now believed that the Grail castle might not be Montségur in France, but instead Montserrat in Spain. Himmler ordered that the sole German-speaking monk at the abbey, Andrew Ripple Noble, should help him with the quest. But if the monk knew anything, he decided against telling Himmler, and the Reichsfuhrer left Spain empty-handed. However, it seems that Himmler's quest did not end there. The next stage of the story would be taken up by an American author, Howard Buchner, in 1991. As a young man in 1945, Buchner was part of the American advance through Europe. Like Rahn, he would become fascinated with the legend of the Grail.
Colonel Howard Buchner had been a surgeon with the American Army 3rd Battalion and was allegedly the first Allied doctor to enter Dachau.
There, he supposedly uncovered information from a captured SS officer, which he included in his book about the Nazi quest for the Grail.
Buchner wrote a book called Emerald Cup, a very curious book.
According to Buchner's sources, now that Himmler had ruled out Spain, he once again focused his attentions on the French Pyrenees. But this time, he decided on a radically different approach. Frustrated with the efforts of academics such as Rahn, Himmler now called upon one of the Reich's greatest military heroes to take up the quest. Otto Skorzeny.
He's a bear of a man. He's very tall, he's very charming, he's very imposing, he's got a dueling scar down one of his cheeks, and in many ways he's a pretty unreconstructed Nazi.
Skorzeny was the chief of Germany's special troops, the most famous and feared commando in the German army. Bold, fearless, and a hero to the Nazi faithful.
Buchner claims that Himmler had dispatched none other than Otto Skorzeny, the famous paratrooper and commando, allegedly the most dangerous man in the world, to retrieve the sacred treasure.
Himmler's tried the academics, he's tried the boffins. Why don't we send Otto Skorzeny?
Skorzeny was more than qualified for the task. In September 1943, he had led a daring raid on a prison in the Italian Alps to free the captured Italian dictator, Benito Mussolini. Dropping in by glider with a squadron of elite German commandos, They came under heavy fire. But Skorzeny would ensure the mission's success and his own glory by returning with Mussolini alive.
He's, in many ways, represents kind of the ultimate one-man Nazi fighting machine. Now, who better to send on your Grail quest, supposedly, than Otto Skorzeny?
So, according to Buchner, in March 1944, Himmler charged Skorzeny with yet another top-secret mission. But this time, to the castle of Montségur in France to find the Grail. Skorzeny decided to look again at Rahn's theory that the Grail had been taken out of the castle 700 years before by escaping Cathars.
Colonel Howard Buchner believed that Otto Skorzeny was able to look at the chateau with a military mind and imagine how such a feat might be possible.
Until now, nobody could understand how the Cathars could have escaped. 3 sides of the castle were besieged by thousands of soldiers, and the remaining side backed onto an impassable precipice. But by studying this cliff, Skorzeny had a revelation.
One side of the castle is this sheer cliff, and obviously everyone thinks, well, the Grail can't be hidden there because that's impossible. There's no way they could have done that. But Skorzeny, because he's this supposed tactical military genius, is the first person to say, but what if it is hidden there?
Skorzeny worked out that by using ropes, the escaping Cathars could have lowered themselves unseen over the castle walls and down the cliff face. If he was right, everyone else had been looking on the wrong side of the mountain.
Skorzeny quickly assumed that the Cathars would have taken the least likely route out of the castle and escaped down the sheer side of the cliff. And according to Buchner, he swiftly picked up their trail from the base of the cliff.
Six days after Skorzeny was said to have arrived at Montségur, it was the anniversary of the Cathar massacre.
March the 16th, 1944 was the 700th anniversary of the fall of the chateau.
A small group of local people chose to mark the occasion with a simple ceremony at the base of the castle. Then, something unexpected happened.
The story has it that while they were getting together on the mountain, that a German aircraft flew overhead.
It's the 700th anniversary of the massacre of the Cathars, and the plane makes a cross, a Cathar cross, in the sky.
Howard Buchner claims that this was a sign from Himmler that Skorzeny had been successful in his mission in recovering the Emerald Cup.
But could this be true? Had Skorzeny really succeeded where everyone else had failed and found the Grail? Buchner's story is certainly entertaining, but there is one fundamental problem with his account. And that concerns Otto Skorzeny.
Whenever you hear the name Otto Skorzeny mentioned in connection with any fantastical story, to me that's a really important signifier that the story is almost certainly going to be an absolute pile of rubbish.
Although Skorzeny was a real person, captured by the Allies at the end of the war, he could not have led this mission.
by linking Scorzeni's alleged retrieval of the Holy Grail to the 700th anniversary of the fall of the castle. It means that he would have to have been here on the 16th of March, 1944.
But the Allies have proof that Otto Skorzeny was not in France in March 1944. He was in Yugoslavia, where the Germans were involved in vicious fighting.
Now, the truth is, when he was supposed to have been supposedly finding the Holy Grail in France, he was in fact, somewhere near the Eastern Front.
Buchner's story gets even wilder, with the Grail being taken by Nazi U-boat to Antarctica, where it is placed in a cave of ice in a secret Nazi base in the Mühlig-Hoffmann Mountains.
I mean, all of it makes for a wonderful story, and certainly after the Indiana Jones movies, we love the idea of uniformed Nazi stormtroopers ransacking the castles of the Pyrenees.
I mean, this is fun, but it's just not true.
But even though Buchner's story is just fantasy, the story of the Nazi hunt for the Grail is not. Heinrich Himmler was obsessed with mysticism, and he did fund expensive expeditions for the Grail, including Rahn's. But he never found it, because in all probability, it never even existed. Heinrich Himmler was eventually captured by the Allies at the end of the war and committed suicide whilst in British custody.
This is the house in Lüneburg where Himmler committed suicide. In that room, the most despicable of all German criminals contrived to take poison after arrest.
But the horrifying truth is that millions of people across Europe would lose their lives on the direct orders of this man. Orders which the Nazis attempted to justify through the work of the Ahnenerbe and men like the Grail hunter Otto Rahn. In 1944, in the ruins of wartime Italy, elite German troops are on a special mission.
We saw people beaten up, killed. They just shot them.
They have been sent by Heinrich Himmler, the head of the Nazis' murderous SS, to seize a precious treasure before Italy falls into Allied hands. They're searching for what has been called the Bible for the Aryan race, a book which will justify the most horrific policies of Nazi Germany.
It gives an academic justification to the idea of a difference between peoples.
This is what our ancestors used to be like, pure and unlike any other people.
Once you create the idea that some races are inferior, then you've got a legitimacy to start murdering people, by the race load.
The book is so important that Himmler will stop at nothing to get it. This is the true story of the Nazi quest for the Book of Power. In January 1933, Adolf Hitler took office as the Chancellor of Germany. But his hold on power was not as secure as it seemed. The Nazis had won less than half the popular vote. The nation was divided, and he needed to unite it.
You've got, in the middle of the 20th century, a country that only really exists as a concept because it was, until just a few years before, in real terms, just a collection of very, very small states. How do you unite these people? Well, the way to unite them is to create a mythology.
The myth that the Nazis hoped could unite the German people was the idea that they were descended from a race superior to all others, the Aryans. The Nazis claimed that the Aryans had originated from Atlantis, the mythical city first described by Plato as the birthplace of all civilization. They claimed that in prehistoric times, these Aryans had settled on the North German plains. They were said to be a race of tall, flaxen-haired warriors who uniquely possessed the genius to create civilization. Hitler believed that the German people were descended directly from these superhumans.
There is this need in the Nazis to demonstrate that they were a kind of cradle of civilization, that they'd been there for a long, long time.
The Nazis claimed that before the ancient Greeks and Romans were ruling the Mediterranean, the ancestors of the Germans had already spawned a great northern European civilization.
There does seem to be a tendency to want to endorse your current position in the world by taking your history as far back as it can go to show that you got there first. Perhaps you're more advanced, perhaps you're more legitimate to be in this role.
This Aryan myth was the one the Nazis believed could rally the German people to their banner.
Everything has to tie back to promote the idea that the Germans are the best, quote, race in the world.
But the fly in the ointment was that there was no proof that this master race had ever existed. But an ancient manuscript was said to exist which supported the Nazis' ideas. It told of a people who lived in Germany thousands of years before, and the Nazis believed that this book would prove all their theories to be true. It was called the Germania and was written in Rome nearly 2,000 years before. In the 1st century AD, the Roman Empire was reaching its height, stretching from Africa and the Mediterranean to the lands of the Britons. But the Germania told of a group of people in the north of mainland Europe who even the Romans could not quell. A people called the Germanen. In 9 AD, one of Rome's most famous generals, Quintilius Varus, led an army of 3 legions to conquer the Germanen. Under their fierce warrior king, Hermann, the Germanen tribes came face to face with the Romans in the Teutoburg forests. There, they dealt the mighty empire a devastating blow. All 3 Roman legions were wiped out.
Germany for the Romans was a very emotive place precisely because of this disaster in AD 9 where this general Quintilius Varus lost these 3 legions.
So great was the disaster, the Roman Emperor Augustus conceded that the Germanen were just too ferocious to be quelled.
Augustus decided that Germany should not be pushed further as a conquest. And that was a very powerful message to send out to subsequent emperors. It's daunting, it's forbidding.
The Nazis claimed that the modern Germans were the direct descendants of King Hermann's fearsome warriors. They also believed that the book, the Germania, held written proof of the superiority of their ancestors. The fabled Germania was written not by a German, but by the Roman senator and orator Cornelius Tacitus around the year 98 AD.
He was one of the most accomplished speakers of his generation, and he had an exemplary political career. He even became a consul and became what many people believe is the greatest Roman historian.
Tacitus wrote at the time of the most decadent period in Roman history. His works describe every sordid detail of the reigns of Rome's leaders, the Emperor Tiberius, Claudius, and Nero. But for the Germanen, Tacitus was apparently full of praise.
He says that no other nation, no other group of people had troubled the Romans so much as the Germans with their strong sense of liberty.
In the book, The Germania, Tacitus describes in admiring detail the culture of the Germanen tribes, the gods they worship, how they select their kings, what weapons they use in battle, and their custom of fiercely training their youth as warriors.
Their characteristics are very much, I think, put on a pedestal as qualities that Romans actually admire. For example, their chastity and their simplicity in terms of not being interested in money, in profit, and that sort of thing.
No one in Germany laughs at vice, nor do they call it the fashion to corrupt and to be corrupted. They choose their kings by birth, their generals by merit. No nation indulges more profusely in entertainments and hospitality.
Tacitus's descriptions appeared to match the image of their ancestors that the Nazis were keen to promote to the German people.
You're presented with idealized native types who have a certain kind of purity about them and go about things in a very different way from Romans.
There's this whole tradition of reading the Germania as if it were a glorification of the noble savage.
More than that, Tacitus describes the physical characteristics of these mighty Germans. He wrote about how they had fierce blue eyes, blonde hair, and huge frames. In short, they were perfect Aryans. For the Nazis, the Germania was proof that the German people were descended from a mighty race superior to all others, and provided a direct link to their Aryan origins. And the words of Tacitus would resonate with one German in particular. In 1924, a young failed chicken farmer called Heinrich Himmler read the Germania on a long train journey and would be inspired by the words of Tacitus.
There he found, written by a Roman historian 2,000 years before, many of the things that he already believed in, so he basically found them confirmed.
After reading the Germania, the young Himmler confided to his diary,
I was lost in the glorious image of the loftiness, purity, and nobleness of our ancestors.
He wrote down in his diary that he hoped that the Germans would be so again, so it had a huge impact on him.
Himmler would go on to become one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany.
Throughout the 1930s, Himmler becomes a very, very key figure in the Third Reich. He's a very underrated figure because he's quiet and unassuming. He looks quite bookish with his little glasses and his short hair, and he's a former chicken farmer, and obviously that's quite funny. But actually, don't underestimate Heinrich Himmler. This is a man, throughout the whole arc of the Nazi regime, is a man who grabs power little by little.
Himmler rose to be head of the SS, a fearsome paramilitary organization which controlled much of the Nazi state. and Himmler would shape his SS in the image of the warrior race described in the Germania.
One could in many ways say that what he promised himself in his diary in 1924, he would then try to live up to as the leader of the SS. He himself conceived of the SS as the vanguard of the future Germanic Empire.
But more than that, Himmler believed the words of Tacitus didn't just have lessons for the SS, but for all true Germans.
The Germania by Tacitus is referred to as a Bible that every thinking German should possess, because people should aspire to be as morally elevated, straightforward, honorable, direct, and brave as their Germanic ancestors allegedly had been.
Himmler wanted the Nazi state to be a reflection of the ancient German society described by Tacitus. Just as in the Germania, children were taught to swear loyalty to their leader, in this case, Adolf Hitler.
The chief fights for victory. His vassals fight for their chief.
Students were taught to be like their warrior forefathers, even wrestling and exercising with weapons.
Naked youths dance amid swords and lances that threaten their lives. Experience gives them skill, and skill again gives grace.
The Honor Cross was awarded to women who bore many children, as this was something much admired in Germanic society.
The offspring reproduced the strength of the parents.
And in the policy of Lebensraum, German people were told that the lands of neighboring countries, which had once been the home of ancient Germanic tribes, were rightfully theirs. But beyond even that, Himmler would use Tacitus to justify the most evil of all Nazi policies. In 1935, the Nazis implemented the first of many racial laws. Called the Law for the Protection of German Blood and Honor, it was an ominous first step in the Nazis' anti-Jewish policies.
It prohibits marriages between Aryan Germans and Jewish Germans.
And it was based on one paragraph of the Germania.
Key line in Germania is when Tacitus writes that the Germans are a people unto themselves, the implication being that there's no breeding with any other race or with any other people. They're a homogeneous group of people.
Tacitus said they hadn't mixed with other people. So not only were they indigenous, but they were pure and unlike any other people.
The Nazis were using the words of Tacitus to justify policies which would unleash an unimaginable terror on the world.
It gives an academic justification to the idea of a difference between peoples. And once you create the idea that some races are inferior, you then create the idea that some lives are worth less than others. And once you create that idea, then you've got a legitimacy to start murdering people, by the race load.
In other words, there is a direct link between their interpretation of the Germania and the Nazi death camps. Because of their understanding of Tacitus, over 11 million people would be murdered in the Nazi genocide.
That's how disastrously influential that particular paragraph was.
So important was this book to Nazi ideology that Himmler desperately wanted the authentic text. The trouble was that no one knew what had happened to Tacitus's original manuscript. So to find it, Himmler turned to one of the strangest and most sinister branches of the SS. It was known as the Ahnenerbe and had been created by Himmler in 1935. Unlike the Germanic warriors who made up the rest of the SS, the Ahnenerbe was an institution made up of academics.
If you want the classic example of how the Nazis manipulated intellectualism and academic behavior, you can go no further than look at the Ahnenerbe. This was an institution set up ultimately by Himmler to research, quote-unquote, German ancestry. And it was to look at how you could construct a mythology of Aryanism and Germanic culture.
The Ahnenerbe were charged with rewriting history to help Himmler to prove that the Aryan Germanic people were superior to all other races.
The Studienstiftung Ahnenerbe. There were genuine intellectuals and researchers and scientists working side by side with real cranks.
And there were around 100 academics of various different sorts working there. You had a support staff of about the same size. So you've got about 200 people. And the Ahnenerbe can't just be seen as a kind of harmless bunch of corrupted academics who were just sucking up to the Nazis. Because what they were proving was helping to create a worldview that was in essence evil.
On Himmler's orders, the Ahnenerbe began to search for Tacitus's lost manuscript. Immediately, they encountered a problem. Tacitus's original no longer existed. In the collapse of the Roman Empire and the ensuing centuries of the Dark Ages, many precious documents were lost. But a glimmer of hope remained. The Ahnenerbe discovered that the manuscript had escaped the fires of Rome. And at some point in history, a single, perfect copy of the original text had been made. But this too was missing.
Well, the survival of classical texts is often a very, very random and hazardous business. The fact that we can read the Germania today dates back to the fact that there was this one manuscript which was copied.
It was said that a traveling Italian scholar had made this beautiful word-for-word copy of the Germania in a monastery in southern Germany in the mid-15th century. This copy of the Germania became known as the Assinas Codex.
And that's the copy that Heinrich Himmler was trying to get his hands on. Because it's as close as you can get to the written account of the Germanic past.
The Ahnenerbe immediately began hunting down the Assinas Codex. They scoured the world in their search. And eventually they brought some good news to Himmler. In 1936, they reported that the book he so desperately wanted had been found. The Assinas Codex had been traced to the east of Italy. For 200 years it had lain in obscurity in the vast private library of an Italian count, the Count Aurelio Baldeschi Baliani.
My father was Conte Aurelio Baldeschi Guglielmi Baleani. In Italy, it's a very important title.
My father had 3 houses. One is this villa where we are now. The other one is a palace in Osimo. And the other is the palace in Iesi.
The Codex Aeschines was stored in the library that they had in the Palazzo in Iesi. People had simply forgotten about it.
The Count's libraries contained many other important documents, such as the letters of Casanova and writings by Cicero.
So it's fairly easy to see how it would get overlooked.
As a result, Count Aurelio Baldeschi Baliani was completely unaware of how important the Aeschines Codex was to the Nazis.
Tacitus or Resino's Codex was the most important book to Germany. We really never realized it was such an important thing.
It was in this library of the family, and it was not really, nobody knew how important it was.
But soon that would change.
Prima di tutto l'agricoltura, che deve trovare sbocchi per I prodotti ubertosi delle vostre terre.
In 1936, Italy was ruled over by Benito Mussolini. Like Hitler, he was another fascist leader. This brutal, populist politician had seized control of Italy in a coup d'etat in 1922 and declared himself Il Duce, the leader. And since coming to power, Hitler, the German Führer, had been carefully courting his Italian counterpart. Now, on Himmler's request, Hitler petitioned the Italian dictator to obtain the manuscript and present it to the Nazi state. It seemed that Mussolini was more than happy to oblige.
Mussolini thought, well, if Hitler wants this book very badly, it's a good idea to give it to him, to try and take it from the family.
Himmler was convinced that it was only a matter of time before he would have it in his grasp. He planned a triumphant return for the Germania at the 1936 Nazi Party convention, where hundreds of thousands of party members would be in attendance. An enormous Germanic room was built with huge panels featuring quotes from Tacitus. And above the door was a quotation from Hitler himself.
German youth shall know, manly loyalty was the virtue of the old Germanen. The new state is erected upon that virtue.
But Himmler hadn't reckoned on the stubbornness of the Count Baldeschi Baliani. An emissary from Mussolini's government was sent to meet the Count at his villa to request him to give up the Aeschines Codex. But the Count Aurelio Baldeschi Baliani was not used to being bossed around.
Mussolini wanted to give it to Hitler as a present, but my father actually didn't like fascism. He didn't like Mussolini.
The Count thought Mussolini was ridiculous, and he had no time for the pompous upstart's demands. So he refused to hand over the book.
He didn't want to make Mussolini too happy. He didn't want to make Hitler happy. I mean, he didn't want to give it away.
I was always proud of my father for everything. Just to say no and just to be very nonchalant about it. I think that demonstrates courage and intelligence.
Himmler was infuriated by Mussolini's failure. To make matters worse, his best hope of getting the book, Hitler, was losing interest in Himmler's obsessions.
Adolf Hitler had, in private conversations on more than one occasion, only snide comments to make. He couldn't quite see what these scholar types, so fascinated with the Germanic past, actually had to contribute to the rise of, the German state.
Himmler liked surrounding himself with all this mythology, whereas Hitler thought this was going all a little bit too far. He saw it as being unnecessary. To him, it was about politics and power.
But Himmler refused to give up. He continued to put pressure on the Baleski-Balianis, sending his own emissaries to meet with the Count.
The interest in the book was very, very, very strong, and so they made several attempts to try and take this book from us.
Finally, after 2 years of mounting pressure, Count Aurelio made a concession. The Germans couldn't have the book, but they could at least have a look at it. Just before the outbreak of the war, the Count packed up the book and sent it to Rome, where it would be photographed for Himmler. In Rome, it was presented to Himmler's emissary.
A member of Ahnenerbe, Rudolf Till, was given access to the Codex Aesinas in Italy, and he was able to produce a set of photographs.
The Ahnenerbe used these photographs to produce a Nazi edition of the Aesinas Codex. Himmler even wrote the foreword himself.
The future will only be granted to those who understand the stock of their ancestry.
But for Himmler, even this was not enough. All he had was a facsimile. He was determined to possess the original. And one day, he would have the chance to take it. In 1939, Hitler plunged the world into war. Under Mussolini, Italy was Germany's most important ally. The two dictators eventually found themselves fighting both the Western powers and Russia. After 4 bloody years, the tide of the war turned against the fascist nations. In 1943, Allied forces landed in the south of Italy. Benito Mussolini was overthrown by an Italian revolt, and Italy switched its allegiance to the Allies. To shore up his southern flank, Hitler was forced to send German troops into Italy. Himmler now saw an opportunity to seize the Aesinas Codex from the Baldeschi-Baliani family. So with the German advance, Himmler now sent an entire unit of his own SS troops to the region, with the express purpose of tracking the book down. But where was it? The Baldeschi Balianis had 3 properties: 2 town palazzi and a country villa. The book could be in any one of them, or none of them. First, Himmler's soldiers were sent to the Baliani's main residence, his villa outside the town of Jesi.
After Mussolini was dead, at the end, the Germans came looking themselves for the book.
But they found the villa empty. Days before, the Count had moved his family out of the villa to one of his other properties to protect them. But Himmler's troops did discover one thing. The Count's servants had taken everything of value from the villa to another of his properties, his palazzo in the town of Jesi, only a few miles away. The Count's treasures had been smuggled out in agricultural carts, hidden from the Germans beneath piles of farm produce.
There were many cars that were going at that time in the center of the town of Jesi, so lots of things were hidden under the wheat and under the grapes.
Could it be that the Asinus Codex was among the valuables? So now Himmler's troops rushed to the palazzo in Jesi.
We asked for the book in a very aggressive way. And also here, the waiters and the chauffeurs and all the people working in the house, maybe pretending they didn't understand the language, maybe risking also their life, because I mean, at those times, life was not so safe like can be today in this kind of situation.
But once again, Himmler's troops found nothing. Neither the Germania nor the Baldeschi family were in the villa at Jesi. Himmler's SS now turned their attentions to the third of the Count's properties, another palazzo 30 kilometers away in the town of Osimo.
My family, they all moved to Osimo. They moved there because they were thinking that it was more safe.
From their hiding place in Osimo, the Baldeschi Balianis witnessed the horrors of life under the Germans.
My brother and I used to look from the window and were really petrified because we saw people beaten up, killed. They just shot them. And so that was really a very, very horrible thing to see. And my parents didn't know we were seeing it, but I mean, children, you know, they climb up on a window and look down.
Eventually, Himmler's soldiers arrived at the palazzo itself.
It was all locked, the house.
They knocked at the door.
They were knocking at the door. I remember this very vividly, and I remember how scared we were that they could break down the door and take my father and kill him.
As the Germans searched the palazzo, the family hid in the cellars below.
I was 10 years old. My brother, one was 9, the other was even less. It was a terrible experience. We spent 18 days down in the cellars without ever coming up.
Himmler's soldiers scoured the house. But they never found the cellar door, and the Baldeschi Baliani family remained safe. So did the book. May the 8th, 1945 brought an end to 6 years of war in Europe. The Nazi dream of a 1,000-year Reich based on the foundations of an ancient Germanic culture had come to nothing. Hitler had shot himself in his Berlin bunker. And Heinrich Himmler swallowed a cyanide capsule whilst in British custody.
This is the house in Lüneburg where Himmler committed suicide. In that room, the most despicable of all German criminals contrived to take poison.
With the war over, the truth about the elusive Assinas Codex would begin to emerge. Did this book really justify the Nazis' murderous policies? And anyway, where was it? One mystery was easily solved. The book had never moved from the first place that Himmler's troops had gone searching for it. The Baldeschi-Baliani's villa outside Jesi had a secret room.
This room has a false window. From the outside you see it, but in fact it's not a window that you can open.
The room with the false window had a hidden door, concealed by a wardrobe.
The door that was already a safety door by itself was also protected by furniture.
So then you could even see the door.
Behind the wardrobe and the hidden door sat a simple chest.
Inside this room there is this cassaforte, we say in Italian. Usually you keep laundry inside.
Concealed inside a pile of laundry lay the thing that had so obsessed Himmler. Tacitus's Germania. With the threat of the Nazis gone, the Baldeschi-Balianis no longer had to hide the book. The Italian government now recognized it as a national treasure, and the Baldeschi-Balianis would display it with pride in their library in Jesi for the next 20 years.
Every year, the Italian government sent some inspectors to see if the book was still with us, if it was well kept.
One year, the inspectors asked the Count to bring the book to Florence, as they couldn't make it to Jesi.
In 1966, they were in Florence, these inspectors, and they said, well, I'll take the book to Florence and I'll show you the book there.
The Count took the book to Florence in person, where he placed it in an underground bank vault overnight for safekeeping. The following day, he would take it to the inspectors. But then disaster.
That was the night of the flood in Florence.
November the 4th, 1966, saw the worst flooding in Florence's history. And water found what Himmler never could.
A flood came, and they weren't waterproof. So all the water with the gas, with the oil and paintings, they all went completely ruined.
This manuscript was ruined for the first 2 or 3 pages, and the last 2 or 3 pages, it was seriously damaged.
The first and the last pages were almost black. The writing looked like a negativa.
It looked as if this treasure had been destroyed forever. Months of costly and painstaking restoration followed, and the damage of the flooding was undone. Today, the Essenes Codex sits in the Biblioteca Nazionale in Rome. After nearly 200 years of holding the book, the Baldeschi-Baliani family had decided that the Essenes Codex should be available for all to see.
Little by little, we decided that this book was better if it was kept in a public place. And so then we gave it to the state, and it went to Rome, to the National Library in Rome.
Now that the oldest version of Tacitus's manuscript can be studied by experts from all nations, a very different picture of the ancient Germans than that promoted by Himmler has emerged. For a start, Tacitus was not as enraptured with the Germanen as Himmler had made out.
Tacitus attributes several clearly negative characteristics to the Germanic tribes. He basically speaks of their tendency towards drunkenness.
To pass an entire day and night in drinking disgraces no one. Their quarrels are seldom fought out with mere abuse, but commonly with wounds and bloodshed.
They were represented as liking their drink too much and having banquets, feasts during the day, this sort of thing.
They themselves lie buried in sloth, a strange combination in their nature that the same men should be so fond of idleness, so averse to peace.
He explicitly writes about their almost addiction to gambling. He also comments on what he describes as a form of laziness, basically.
They pass much of their time in idleness, giving themselves up to sleep and to feasting, the bravest and the most warlike doing nothing.
A sort of simple society, but one which has its flaws.
In fact, what Tacitus described was far from the perfect Aryan society claimed by Himmler.
In every household, the children, naked and filthy. They will be overcome by their own vices as easily as by the arms of an enemy.
It has become increasingly clear that the Ahnenerbe had only taken from Tacitus what they could use to support Himmler's theories of Germany's noble Aryan ancestors.
They blatantly misinterpreted, misread, and misquoted particular passages that didn't really fit their particular ideological view to make it fit their ideological view.
They've been highly selective. They've taken little bits of it, primarily around chapter 4, where he's talking about their racial purity, their blue eyes, their blonde hair, that sort of thing. And they've taken this work and very much, I think, made it what they want it to be.
And the Nazis had chosen to keep hidden another key fact about Tacitus. He had almost certainly never even seen any of the Germanen he was writing about, and had no real evidence for his statements about them. Some of his descriptions were plainly made up.
By the end of the monograph, you have this fantasy, bizarre sort of image of people with human faces but the bodies of animals. So it begins to enter the world of the fantastic. So you have to be wary of that when you're reading these texts.
Himmler also willfully ignored another fact. Modern-day Germans could not be the direct descendants of the Germanen.
The Nazis, in referring to the Germanic tribes, referred to them as ancient Germans or the old Germans. And that's exactly the kind of step that you must not make, because it is a simplification.
The Germani are different from the people that we would think of today as Germans. That's just the name that came to be used for the whole group of people.
They misidentified the German ancestors with the Germanic tribes that Tacitus describes, so you simply can't say that the Germanic tribes were the German ancestors.
The truth was that Hitler's Germans were descendants of many different peoples, not a single ancient tribe.
There was no German nation, and the whole tribal situation changed dramatically several times over the following centuries. So you can simply say, those are our ancestors.
But Himmler was unconcerned about the truth of what Tacitus really said and the truth of the origins of the German people. He desired the Asinus Codex to help promote the vicious and racist policies of the Nazis. And the tragic fact is that even without ever laying his hands on the original, he was still able to use the words of Tacitus to aid the Nazis in their murderous policies, which resulted in the death of millions.
In 1938, an amazing expedition set out to explore a remote, sacred land beyond the Himalayas, Tibet.
The expedition was an extraordinary achievement. Those months they spent in that strange land, opening it up.
The explorers were a team of elite Nazi scientists, led by a glamorous adventurer.
He was the Indiana Jones of the Third Reich.
Dispatched on a mission by the most feared man in Nazi Germany, Heinrich Himmler. His quest was as audacious as it was ambitious. To find evidence that linked German Aryans to the ancient super race of a lost empire.
If only Tibet could yield up, the land of the snows could yield up its secrets.
This is Himmler's quest to find the fabled lost people of Atlantis. In 1936, one of Nazi Germany's rising stars, 26-year-old zoologist Ernst Schaefer, was officially summoned to SS headquarters in Berlin. He had an appointment with the most powerful and feared man in the Third Reich. Not Adolf Hitler, but Heinrich Himmler. As Reichsführer, Himmler commanded an elite SS paramilitary force 250,000 strong. A black-clad army dedicated to the supremacy of the German race. He was chief of all police throughout Germany, including the secret police, the brutal Gestapo. Himmler organized the arrest and detention of Jews as controller of a growing number of concentration camps.
The SS was a huge set of tentacles reach out into Germany, and they're SS tentacles, and Himmler is chief of them.
Now Himmler's tentacles were reaching out to envelop the young scientist Ernst Schaefer. Himmler wanted him to solve a problem. The Nazis claimed that the Germans were the master race, destined to rule. This ideology justified the Germans' domination of Europe and hatred of the Jews. Himmler needed German superiority to be proved a fact. For his proof, he turned to an ancient myth, the lost world of Atlantis. Atlantis was described as a vast continent in the Atlantic Ocean. Its people were elite humans who conquered and dominated all other cultures and races. The empire of Atlantis reached into Europe, Africa, and South America. But for Himmler, Atlantis wasn't a story, but historical fact.
So Atlantis, he came to believe, Himmler, had actually existed. It wasn't a myth, but it was also scientifically based. There had been an Atlantis.
Getting evidence that the descendants of the Atlanteans were none other than the German people wasn't easy. The island of Atlantis disappeared in a day and a night. It was destroyed by earthquakes and volcanoes, consumed by the ocean, and lost beneath the waves forever. Far from the Atlantean civilization being lost in the cataclysm, Himmler believed it lived on. He held that Atlantis gave birth to every great civilization: the Greeks, the Romans, the Mayans and Aztecs of South America, even the ancient Egyptians. That these inferior peoples had been bequeathed their culture by the superior people of Atlantis.
From the very beginning, it's all to do with race. Racism impregnates the Atlantis myth. It's about a superior race of beings who spread this knowledge around the world.
Himmler had a specific mission for Schaefer. He was to lead an SS scientific expedition and bring him proof that German Aryans were the descendants of this superior race, the lost people of Atlantis. Himmler had chosen Schaefer in particular for this task, not only for his scientific credentials, but because he was already a famous explorer. In 1930s Germany, Dr. Ernst Schaefer cut a heroic figure. He'd been a member of 2 American-led expeditions into Tibet. He was a fastidious scientist and passionate hunter who loved to study mammals and birds in the wild, and after he'd shot them. An ambitious self-publicist, he wrote books about his exploits as a young sharp-shooting adventurer. They made him a celebrity in Germany.
He becomes, for Germans, an embodiment of the ideal German in a way. I think that's how Himmler regarded him. A sort of heroic, brave, physically resourceful. The cliché would be Indiana Jones, the Indiana Jones of the Third Reich.
Ernst Schaefer was the ideal person to lead the SS scientific expedition into Tibet. Himmler pledged him his personal support. Himmler told Schaefer that in ancient times, survivors of Atlantis had founded a great civilization in Asia. One mysterious country least diluted by the centuries of history was remote Tibet.
For Heinrich Himmler, Tibet had an extraordinary appeal. The supermen of the Aryan race had gone there and in the fastness of Tibet had re-established their culture and their ways, cut off, remote from the outside world.
In the 1930s, Tibet was one of the few scientifically unresearched areas of the world. Situated in the center of Asia, but isolated by the Himalayan mountains, the Tibetan plateau covers nearly 1 million square miles at an altitude of up to 15,000 feet. Could this natural fortress have sheltered survivors of Atlantis? If they did settle there, then the isolation would have kept them racially pure. They would be distant cousins, of the German master race.
If Tibet could be reopened and the evidence of the supermen of the past be rediscovered, here was the best proof possible of the validity of the argument that modern Germany and the Nazi movement and the Aryans of Germany now were directly related to the supermen.
Tibet at this point in time was so unexplored compared to other regions of the world that any expedition to Tibet would be a big coup.
To lead his own expedition into Tibet was a dream come true for the ambitious Schaefer. But there was a sting in the tail. Doing science for the SS meant doing it the SS way. In 1935, Himmler set up the Ahnenerbe, a research organization within the SS. Its job was to prove Nazi ideology.
The idea is to help a number of German scientists dig into the past of the German peoples and in a way to endorse them as the superior people of Europe.
The Ahnenerbe recruited corrupt scientists and scholars prepared to ransack Germany's past and glorify it.
We would say that Ahnenerbe is an attempt to rewrite history. Himmler claimed it was a rediscovery of the true German history. And that's why all aspects of archaeology, philology, semantics, language, you name it, any ology or onomy, it had to be taken into Ahnenerbe because those elements could become means by which the truth of the great German past could be rediscovered.
What is remarkable is that the German state of the time, the Nazi state, certainly according to the SS chief Heinrich Himmler, needed to create its own mythologies.
The ancient swastika symbol was appropriated to represent Nazi power and signify their hatred of what they saw as inferior peoples. The Ahnenerbe also undermined what it saw as anti-German science. Even the great Einstein, because he was Jewish.
German nationalists resented the achievements of Jewish scientists, and they came up with an absurd idea that their science was in some way Jewish and therefore not wanted in Germany. And this did force them to validate science that was really very mediocre, if not absurd.
Schaefer's scientific pride faced an even bigger challenge. Himmler's quasi-historical account of Atlantis, backed by the Ahnenerbe's pseudo-science, was to him a fantasy without foundation. As a scientist, he didn't believe a word of it. Schaefer thought that he could ride the Nazi tiger, and that this expedition would ensure a glittering scientific career.
I think he was quite ambitious in many ways, but also very much willing to manipulate people, willing to manipulate institutions so that he would get what he wanted.
Desperate to return to Tibet, Schaefer couldn't resist Himmler's offer. So Schaefer made a devil's pact with Himmler. To realize his ambition, he agreed to an impossible task. And ultimately, he would pay a heavy price. Ernst Schaefer was a political animal, always able to manipulate a situation to his advantage. Or so he thought. In 1933, Schaefer had been studying for his doctorate when Hitler was elected Reichschancellor of Germany and the Nazis swept to power. The Nazis' racial policies caused many Jews to leave the country, as did many scientific researchers. But Schaefer embraced the new order and signed up to Himmler's increasingly powerful SS. In Nazi Germany, that's how ambitious young scientists got ahead.
It was actually very sensible of Schaefer to join the SS in 1933. He was ambitious. He had unusual ambitions. He didn't just want a university seat. He wanted support for his work as a naturalist. He rightly believed that the SS would back him.
He himself said that politics serves science and science serves politics. If he could make that illusion himself, then it would justify and explain why he was so willing, so ready to join a political movement, because it gave him the scientific freedom to pursue the researches that he believed was his mission.
But Schaefer found the realities of mixing politics and science impossible from the start. Schaefer's meticulous scientific methods would never chime with Himmler's bizarre cut-and-paste theories. So while Schaefer benefited from official SS support, he also suffered from official SS interference. The Ahnenerbe plied him with its preferred candidates to join the SS expedition to Tibet. Corrupt archaeologists, self-styled mystics, and pseudo-scientists.
Now, the Ahnenerbe is very curious because there are some genuine scientists working for it. They're probably rather embarrassed. But there are some cranks as well. You have a fellow called Willigut, or Weisthor, who is literally insane. And yet, Himmler regards him as a kind of guru, as a wise man. People like Schaefer, they're appalled when they stumble on people like Willigut. You can imagine their reaction, what am I doing here with people like this?
Pseudoscience was anathema to the rigorous and ambitious Schaefer. Risking Himmler's wrath, Schaefer rejected the Ahnenerbe's candidates.
Schaefer was able to resist some of the more overt pressure that Himmler was putting on him. Schaefer also was able to keep his distance from the Ahnenerbe, the ancestral heritage, as such, and be semi-independent, really, of all of it.
Schaefer's vision was very different and very clear. He wanted to conduct an objective scientific survey of Tibet, a comprehensive study of its terrain and wildlife, of its people and their customs. It was a holistic approach to science ahead of its time. The great naturalist Charles Darwin had the Galapagos Islands, and Schaefer would have Tibet.
Schaefer and a number of other European naturalists believed that the Himalayas were a kind of source point for many different species, if not all species in the world. So to go to the Himalayas, which is where Tibet is, was a means of going back to the source, of understanding how species developed and spread across the world.
There was a theory that Tibet was essentially like a sort of waterfall of species, and that there was something interesting happening there genetically.
Schaefer wrote a manifesto describing the kind of men he wanted to take with him.
An ideologically homogeneous, healthy team, comradeship according to soldierly principles, in which each member possesses, in addition to his sound knowledge of his subject, of which he is a master, also as much versatility as possible.
Schaefer wanted true scientists, but he was still playing a political game. Himmler wanted each scientist to have one vital qualification: membership of the SS.
There were plenty of academics in this period who were not members of the SS. So I think Schaefer took a lot of SS members partly because that brought prestige, partly that made sure that Himmler would not necessarily withdraw his patronage.
To achieve his vision of pure scientific research, Schaefer himself would go as zoologist ornithologist, botanist, and of course, team leader. As team geologist, he chose 24-year-old Karl Wienert, and as entomologist, 38-year-old Ernst Krause.
There was one member of the expedition was interested in Tibetan insects, butterflies, and so on. Another member of the expedition was meticulously taking geomagnetic readings at different points across the Himalayas. I don't think you can really say there is a Nazi kind of butterfly collector, or that there is anything political about geomagnetism.
But Schaefer couldn't ignore Himmler's quest to find evidence of an ancient Nordic invasion of Tibet. So he did accept one Ahnenerbe candidate onto his team, 26-year-old anthropologist Bruno Beger.
When you come to Bruno Beger, the expedition anthropologist, I think you are looking at a political scientific research project, which is to investigate the connections between the peoples of the Himalayas and Europeans.
Deciphering a person's racial heritage was Beger's speciality. He'd been trained to do this by measuring people. Skull shape and facial features were thought by racial anthropologists to be particularly important. They separated what they saw as the superior Aryan race from the inferior races.
Bruno Beger had done some research on racial theories and racial mixing in particular. He had worked with Heinrich Günther, who was a very famous big shot amongst racial scientists in the Third Reich.
Schaefer realized racial anthropology was essential to the success of his expedition. He needed Beger. He was the only person who might find the evidence Himmler had asked him to provide.
Beger and Schaefer at this point both really believe in a lot of the ideas that are around in National Socialist Germany. They do primarily see themselves as scientists in their future careers, really. The problem with that, however, of course, is that science and politics are very, very closely linked in Nazi Germany. You can't have science without the politics.
Himmler believed they would produce enough evidence to justify the expedition itself, and it would add to his dream of recreating a German culture linked very directly to the Aryan past.
Schaefer had his team in place. After a year of preparation, he was ready to lead his expedition into Tibet. But his timing couldn't have been worse. By the spring of 1938, Europe was in political turmoil. The German war machine was gearing up. The Nazis had reoccupied the Rhineland taken from Germany at the end of the First World War, and now marched into German-speaking Austria, the first steps to a greater Germany. The international situation didn't stop Schaefer's expedition setting out from Berlin on April the 19th, 1938. But it could stop him getting to Tibet. War in Asia left Schaefer only one possible route to Tibet, through India. And this brought him into direct conflict with the British Empire. Tibet was a nominally independent country, ruled in the absence of the young Dalai Lama by a regent and a council of ministers. The British ensured they were the only Europeans allowed to advise the Tibetan government.
The British at this point in time weren't really that keen on allowing Schaefer into Tibet. However, that wasn't necessarily completely uncharacteristic. The British had never been particularly keen on allowing foreign expeditions into Tibet. The Tibetan government itself was also never particularly keen on allowing anyone other than the British into Tibet.
Schaefer nevertheless sailed via the Suez Canal for India. In this sensitive situation, he played down the SS support for his expedition to avoid antagonizing the British. But a Nazi newspaper ran a glowing article celebrating the expedition's glorious SS connections. Before Schaefer even arrived, British and Indian newspapers burst into print, with headlines screaming, "Gestapo agent in India." They were accused of being German spies. It was a disaster for Schaefer. The British authorities didn't give the German expedition permission even to enter India. The precious expedition Schaefer had prepared for all his life was over before it had even started. Again, Himmler's personal support was crucial. He wrote a bitter letter of complaint to Britain, read by the British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain.
You know yourself that up to now my attitude towards every Englishman who has come to Germany has been entirely friendly. For that reason, I am the more astonished that the English should treat one of my men in a brusque, wounding and unfriendly way. I cannot imagine the authorities are so stupid as to see in the scientist Dr. Schaefer, officially dispatched by me, a spy.
Despite the gathering pace of Nazi Germany's war machine, Britain was still trying to appease Hitler. So after Himmler's intervention, the British backed down.
Appeasement is the big word of the time, that Britain has accepted that avoidance of war is the prime consideration, and therefore wants amicable relations as far as they can be achieved with Germany.
The British eventually gave Schaefer permission to go into northern India, to explore the remote province of Sikkim. But he was expressly forbidden to enter Tibet without official leave. Schaefer was not a man to take no for an answer, but he had to take what he could get, for the time being. Once in Sikkim, Schaefer expanded his operation, hiring porters and pack horses, buying food and equipment. Despite being forbidden to enter Tibet, Schaefer also hired Tibetan speakers. As close as possible to the Tibet border, Schaefer set his team to work on their varied scientific research, collecting data for his scientific survey, and also for Himmler's quest for European traits he believed would racially link the German people to the Atlantean superrace. Sikkim became a place of great interest to Bega.
There are many people in northern India who are descended from Tibetans, so Bega had a lot to start with.
For an anthropologist and ethnologist like Bega, the races of this remote area were fascinating. As Schaefer noted,
nearly all these fragment tribes have preserved their own cultures and their own languages and are distinguished by well-marked racial characteristics.
Bega made meticulous measurements, compared eye color to a chart, and compared hair color to graded samples. No detail was too small or obscure for his specialist equipment to measure.
He'd brought a vast array of scientific instruments, which could all be ordered from scientific mail catalogues in the Third Reich, really. One particularly outlandish instrument that he brought was an instrument designed to measure the curvature of fingernails, for instance.
Racial anthropologists measured racial identity and status in the shape of the skeleton, and in particular, the skull. The cephalic index was the ratio between the breadth and depth of the head. A long, narrow Teutonic head indicated North European ancestry.
He would measure the ratio between your forehead and your nose, the distance between your eyebrows, and all sorts of very intricate measurements. And although it seems rather crude now, he is in a way measuring your genetic inheritance.
If they could prove by physical measurement of the head and the face and so on, that indeed the Tibetans were a direct link physically with modern Germans, then the link between the Superman notion settled in the Shangri-La of Tibet and modern Germany would be made.
Beger's expert measurements of the short, dark-skinned, black-haired peoples of Sikkim would struggle to find evidence for Himmler's fantasy of the superhuman, blonde, blue-eyed conquerors of Tibet. Himmler wanted evidence of a dominant strain of people. In his mind, these would naturally form the upper class, the Tibetan ruling elite.
He's particularly interested in Tibetan aristocrats in Lhasa, and he wants to find a connection between the Tibetan elite and Nordic people.
But the British had condemned Schaefer to fester in Sikkim. As weeks turned into months, he realized his expedition was doomed to fail if they couldn't get over the Tibetan border. He wrote in his diary,
"We are at Tibet's frontier. It is the realm of our most powerful yearning. Up there, not far away at all, is the border pass."
The border haunted Schaefer's imagination. There was nothing physically to stop him.
There are neither guards nor sentinels, neither barrier nor gates. At that lonely altitude, there is only an oboe, a heap of stones wrapped in prayer flags.
Schaefer, in desperation, was even considering sneaking over the border. If he did, he risked more damaging anti-Nazi headlines and an international incident. But if he didn't, he'd face Himmler's fury.
No one on the expedition wants to go back to Germany, having not got to Tibet. So for Schaefer, this is a crisis moment.
He'd put up a massive expedition, put a lot of personal effort and investment into all of this.
Somehow he has to cross the Himalayas. Otherwise he's going to lose face in Germany. He doesn't want to be humiliated.
Schaefer was torn. He felt honor bound to resist the temptation.
"I have promised the Viceroy not to cross the Tibetan border without official leave. And as a German, I'm not willing to break a promise. But what does official leave mean?"
Schaefer was looking for a way to wriggle out of his promise to the British. And he was in luck. One day, Beger noticed a rather well-dressed Tibetan riding past the camp. He recorded the event in his diary.
Suddenly, a Tibetan appeared. My next thought is to measure him. Then our native translator whispers to us that this is a high official.
Here was an important advisor to a man of influence. Tering Raja, a Tibetan prince who ruled the province just over the forbidden border. Schaefer seized the opportunity to ingratiate himself with the Tibetan ruling class. The charm offensive might be his first step on the road to Lhasa. The team got off to a good start, observing Tibetan protocols as they served tea. Schaefer, they made out, was a great and powerful leader. Schaefer, in his turn, spoke of his love of Tibet and how he yearned to see Lhasa, and they showered their honored guest with gifts. Schaefer gave him a begging letter in Tibetan to take to his master, Tering Raja. He hoped the prince might intercede with the ruling council to let him enter Tibet. It was a slim hope, and all Schaefer could do was wait. As the summer of 1938 slipped into autumn, Schaefer remained isolated on the India-Tibet border. It seemed that the British had won. He was trapped. Then, after 5 months of waiting, a letter from Lhasa.
To the German Herr Dr. Schaefer, master of 100 sciences.
First, the ruling council declared that Tibet is forever prohibited to foreigners. But then the letter took on a more friendly tone.
It nevertheless appears from your letter that you intend only friendship and to see the Holy Land and its religious institutions.
Then at last the translator read the news they thought would never come.
We grant you permission to enter Lhasa and stay there for 14 days.
The elation was indescribable. All 5 German scientists were invited by the Tibetan ruling council to visit Lhasa for 2 weeks. Schaefer had wriggled out of his promise to the British. Here was the longed-for official leave.
It was pretty spectacular getting these German scientists into Lhasa.
Getting into Lhasa was a big propaganda coup, really, for Nazi Germany. Particularly so since the Nazis did, at this point in time, make a lot out of the fact that Germans could supposedly deal with non-European peoples better than the British.
With news of the historic invitation, Himmler promoted the whole team. Schaefer to the rank of Hauptsturmführer, a captain in the SS. On January the 19th, 1939, Schaefer saw the Dalai Lama's vast Futile palace towering over Lhasa. It was an historic occasion. They were the first Germans ever to enter the holy city. The Tibetan government had officially invited Schaefer, so he expected a grand welcome. But just a single official greeted them. A British representative in Lhasa had intervened and changed the ruling council's minds. Schaefer's great coup would soon turn to abject failure if the nobles of Lhasa ignored his expedition. Now Schaefer the politician got to work. Showing due deference, he lavished the finest gifts on the ministers and nobility of Lhasa.
What Schaefer did in Lhasa, there was definitely a fair bit of politics. Schaefer was trying to build up friendly relations with the Tibetan government. Up until that point in time, the Tibetan government had only really dealt with the British government.
Schaefer paid particular attention to the regent, Rating Rinpoche, the ruler of Tibet. Schaefer found he had a unique advantage over the British in getting close to the Tibetans. Germany and Tibet, he told them, shared a common bond: the swastika. For centuries, Tibetans had regarded the ancient symbol as a sign of good fortune and permanence. Schaefer made gifts of Nazi emblems, explaining to his hosts how revered the symbol was in Germany. The Tibetans were delighted, not knowing that in Europe at that very moment, the swastika was a symbol of oppression and violence. With this deception, Schaefer scored another great political coup.
The regent later on sent a letter back home to Hitler, addressing him as the German king, and asked for more contact between Germany and Tibet and friendly relations.
To His Majesty Adolf Hitler, I have pleasure to let your majesty know that Dr. Schaefer and his party, who are the first Germans to visit Tibet, have been allowed without any objection, and every necessary assistance is rendered on their arrival.
Thanks to Schaefer's access, the ruling council gave the Germans unprecedented freedom to film Lhasa, its monasteries and medieval setting. Schaefer and his team documented the exotic streets and markets with their rich variety of food and cloth and jewelry. But Schaefer's personal research was suffering. The wonderful letter from Lhasa had also imposed a terrible condition that struck at the heart of why Schaefer was in Tibet at all: hunting. It was a bitter blow. Schaefer had traveled halfway round the world only to be banned from collecting wildlife for his own research. Well, not quite. Schaefer did manage to hunt, but quietly, mainly with a catapult and only the occasional bullet, when no one was about.
Schaefer, of course, did really circumvent some of the conditions, although not in a very ostentatious manner.
Beger's work also suffered a severe setback. During the colourful New Year festival, as Schaefer and the team filmed the magnificent dances and parades, they got too close with their cameras and were stoned and injured by angry monks. After that, Beger's work measuring people was considered by the team to be provocative and foolhardy. A frustrated Beger saw an extraordinary variety of people slip through his fingers. Shaven-headed monks in dark red robes, burly yak herders dressed in heavy sheepskin, delicate officials in shimmering chubas, and what he described as many beautiful and tall people with even features. He couldn't gather any hard physiological data that might fulfill Himmler's quest. Yet while the science expedition was stalled, the Germans remained great friends of the regent. He extended the expedition's stay from 2 weeks to 2 months. Schaefer had sidelined the British, much to their annoyance.
Well, the British were worried partly that Schaefer would be able to stoke up anti-British sentiment in Tibet. In fact, this becomes more and more of an issue throughout 1939 as appeasement in Europe started to fail.
In September 1938, in a spirit of appeasement, the British had brokered the Munich Agreement and let Nazi Germany occupy the largely German-speaking Sudetenland, then part of Czechoslovakia. But 2 months later came Kristallnacht, one night of violence by brown shirts and civilians that left 91 Jews dead and 30,000 in concentration camps. The true nature of Nazism had been revealed. The time for appeasement was over. The Germans still enjoyed official approval. His team were allowed to leave Lhasa to explore the holiest places in Tibet, banned even to the British. But as they explored the sacred Yarlung Valley east of Lhasa, they began to receive messages urging them to return home to Germany.
Schaefer was keen to stay and explore areas that hadn't been explored by many other people, just to make his expedition special, just to really enable him to use what he was doing to obtain fame, really, back in Germany.
A European war seemed increasingly likely, even inevitable. If they waited much longer, they risked being interned by the British as enemy aliens. The expedition was running out of time. By March 1939, Nazi Germany had expanded east again to occupy Bohemia and Moravia. But Britain had a mutual assistance pact with Poland, and any further German advance into Poland could not be so easily ignored. Europe was on the brink of war. Even the ebullient Schaefer was becoming increasingly anxious about British intentions and began to fear arrest and detention in India. Bega reported that in the summer of 1939, Schaefer received a letter from his father and was so deeply affected by it that he disappeared for an hour.
His father pointed out there's a war coming, and he said to the son, if I were you, I would make the best of what you've had and return.
If Schaefer wanted a chance of actually getting all his samples and specimens and data back to Germany and make something out of them and make a name for himself, he really needed to leave before war broke out.
Bega wrote that he and the others were also being warned they were in danger.
We sat around the fireplace and discussed it. Suddenly we realized a letter and transmission from Berlin had the same message. My wife had been hinting too.
The war, they were told, would start after the summer. That was only weeks away. It was time to go home to Germany. Despite the rising political tension and Schaefer's fears of capture and detention, the team were allowed safe passage through India by the British. The 5 SS officers were even able to fly out of Calcutta with British Indian Airways. But what would Himmler have to say about Schaefer's lack of evidence for his quest for the people of Atlantis? And what might he do? Even worse, when the team touched down in Munich, Heinrich Himmler himself would be there waiting. Now would come the reckoning. But Himmler welcomed Schaefer and his team as heroes.
Here were fine young men, great scientists, you could call them, or young Germans at their best. It showed them opening up the world, or restoring the evidence, looking for the evidence, being adventurous, giving Germany that sense of encompassing some of the best virtues and values of a modern civilization linked to the Aryan past. That they didn't make the link in physical hard terms, in a sense, didn't matter. The expedition in itself was its own justification.
Himmler was elated by Schaefer's achievements. In Tibet, he had trounced the British and proven German dominance in the region.
The propaganda value of the expedition was definitely greater than the scientific value of the expedition. Himmler certainly was delighted by the outcome, shaking the expedition members' hands at the airport.
Just 27 days later, Nazi Germany, fatally committed to its policy of territorial and racial domination, invaded Poland. The Second World War began. Schaefer was not yet 30 when he returned to Germany a national hero. But what had his extraordinary expedition to Tibet actually achieved? Schaefer's personal scientific vision came to nothing. Most of the huge amount of data his hand-picked team of scientists gathered lay unexamined and then lost in the tumult of war. What of the proof of the super race of Atlantis? It seems Himmler had asked the wrong guys. He'd certainly asked the wrong question. Even racial anthropologist Bruno Bega had found the Atlantis Nordic idea hard to swallow.
Bega was trying to find out what kind of racial mixture there was in Tibet. I don't think Bega's research was as grand as believing the Nordic race had changed all of Asian history.
Bruno Bega said that when they were gathered round the campfire in northern India or Tibet, they would reminisce about some of Himmler's stranger views and laugh about them.
But these men, as SS scientists, were supporting Nazi ideology, working with a man whose crimes were beyond imagining.
Heinrich Himmler, let's not forget he was a super efficient bureaucrat who created a state within a state that carried out the worst genocide in human history. So we shouldn't reduce him to an eccentric or a crank.
Himmler, to avoid trial for his crimes and death by hanging, committed suicide after the war. In February 1943, Bega was sent to Auschwitz to make facial masks of prisoners. Soon afterwards, 109 Jews he had worked on were gassed for an infamous Nazi project, the Jewish Skull Collection. In 1971, Bega was tried and convicted as an accomplice to murder. He received a 3-year suspended sentence. After the war, Schaefer's glittering career evaporated. He took a job creating a wildlife park in Venezuela, one of the sanctuaries for Nazis in South America. Schaefer's life was cursed by his membership of the SS and close association with the evil Heinrich Himmler. The Salzkammergut Lake District in Austria is known as the Devil's Dustbin. At the end of World War II, rumors spread that the Nazis came here to hide Europe's plundered gold.
Gold oiled Hitler's war machine. Gold was essential to Hitler.
As the Allies closed in, the Nazis started hiding their loot wherever they could.
I saw them throwing the boxes into the lake.
And there's one lake so deep and so remote that it's said to have been the Nazis' favorite dumping site, Lake Toplitz. The stories of what's been dubbed the Nazis' El Dorado have obsessed treasure hunters for the last 70 years.
Man stops thinking logically when it comes to gold.
When a team of divers explored Lake Toplitz for the first time.
On the monitor, I could see there is something there.
They didn't discover gold, but something every bit as extraordinary. The dying days of World War II. Hitler was in his bunker, unable to accept defeat. But most Nazis knew the game was up. It was time to start hiding evidence of their crimes. A unit of SS officers were instructed to transport boxes to the Salzkammergut Lake District in the Austrian Alps. But their mission ground to a halt. The road didn't go as far as the lake they'd been instructed to reach. They needed alternative transport to get their secret cargo to its destination, Lake Toplitz. Ida Weisenbacher was 21 years old when the SS woke her grandfather demanding assistance.
At 5 a.m. they called, and straight away they were at the door, the 2 SS men. They needed a horse and cart to get to Lake Toplitz. And then my grandfather said, that's not possible. The horses haven't been fed yet. No, they needed the horse and cart. It was really important. You've got to harness the horses.
Ida Weisenbacher was terrified for her life and quickly followed instructions.
They said it has to be done quickly. The boxes have to go to Lake Toplitz.
But Ida noticed something that puzzled her. The boxes weren't all the same.
There were heavy ones and light ones. They were different, big and small. The small ones were heavy, really heavy.
Ida asked what was in the heavy boxes, but was met with a stony silence.
The SS man who came with me didn't give anything away. I asked, where are you from? He wouldn't tell me anything. It was all very strict. Everything had to disappear in great secrecy.
Ida made the journey 3 times, and when they got to the lake the second time, she witnessed something bizarre.
When I got back with the second load, I saw them throwing the boxes into the lake.
She didn't realize it at the time, but what Ida Weisenbacher witnessed may have been one of the final acts of the biggest bank heists in history. The sheer scale of the Nazis' theft of Europe's treasures was astonishing.
The plunder of Europe was, from the beginning, a part of the Nazi war plan. It was their idea to collect everything which was valuable across Europe.
The Nazis plundered the museums and private collections of the newly occupied countries for priceless works of art.
Hitler was an art fan, and he was fascinated by art, treasures. He collected things. He tried to get hold of ancient paintings, ancient statues by famous painters, by famous artists.
Hitler's deputy, head of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Goering, personally amassed a vast collection of looted art and gold, sent to him from across occupied Europe, estimated to have been worth $200 million. But from the beginning, what the Nazis wanted most of all was gold. Gold bars that could be stored in bank vaults and exchanged for foreign currency whenever it was needed.
It started in 1938 with the occupation of Austria. They took the national reserves of Austria the moment they entered Vienna. They continued in Czechoslovakia and went on, because what the Nazis, of course, needed was gold.
The Nazis stole $2.5 million worth of gold from Czechoslovakia, $200 million worth of gold from France and Belgium, And later in the war, $30 million from Hungary and $100 million from Italy.
The Nazis stole the gold from the gold reserves of the countries that they conquered. Gold was essential to Hitler. Everybody has the mythical idea that Hitler was just, and Germany was rolling in money as it is now. But in fact, Germany didn't have enough food to feed its people.
In total, Berlin accumulated $500 million worth of foreign gold, the equivalent of over $36 billion in today's money. Gold fed the Nazi war machine.
They smelted down the gold, they stamped it with fake stamps as if it came from the Prussian mint, and they sent it to Zurich, and the Swiss gave them foreign currency for it.
Swiss banks became complicit in the Nazis' theft of Europe's gold.
An American investigating group determined that of the $400 million, which is a lot of money then, 50 years ago, of the $400 million that was sent through, to Switzerland from Germany, 300 million of it was stolen.
There is a reason why the Nazis never attacked Switzerland, because it was their banking place. It was their way to shore up their treasures, but it was also their place to do the trade with all sorts of foreign countries.
The Americans and the Allies begged the Swiss to stop taking the gold, and they refused. They continued to take gold until 1945, when the Germans had more or less lost the war.
But there was only so much gold in Europe's banks Hitler and his armies could steal. The SS were instructed to find alternative sources.
They began to run out of gold, so what did they do? They did, as we know, this terrible war crime. Before the Jews were killed in Auschwitz, they pulled the gold out of their mouths, and they melted it down into bars.
The SS stripped concentration camp victims of an estimated $70 million worth of gold teeth and jewelry. But by 1945, as the Allies swept into Germany, some Nazis began to consider the unthinkable. What if they lost? Where would they go? And what would they do with their stolen gold?
The Germans kept these gold bars and other robbed treasures, and particularly art, out of the way of anybody who might have grabbed it.
The Nazi gold was under threat. Hitler instructed the SS to make Berlin's reserves disappear.
They started to move things, to move treasures, to move gold underground in mountain deposits.
But the Americans got wind of Hitler's orders. On the 4th of April 1945, they entered the German town of Merkers and discovered a vast hoard in an abandoned salt mine. Over 8,000 gold bars, worth $240 million.
The 100 tons of gold bullion represents most of Germany's reserve.
They couldn't believe their eyes. They were just blinded by the incredible amount of gold just packed away there.
It wasn't just gold, but over 1 billion German marks, millions in foreign currency, and 400 tons worth of priceless works of art. But it was only part of the stolen hoard. the Allies knew the Nazis were on the run and looking to hide.
One of the best places to do that was Austria, and specifically the mountains of Austria and the Salzkammergut.
Secretly, the Nazis sent freight trains south in the hope of evading the Americans approaching from the west and the Russians from the east.
When those trains rolled into the Salzkammergut, they were just packed up to the top with all sorts of treasures, gold, valuables, paintings, all the Nazis finally could get hold of before they had to leave.
Some of Hitler's most senior generals fled with their loot, including second in command in the SS, Ernst Kaltenbrunner.
Kaltenbrunner, this high-ranking SS criminal, took the stuff he had collected during the years of his career and brought it back here to the Salzkammergut.
Kaltenbrunner took refuge in this house by Lake Autosee, 16 miles from Lake Toplitz.
Kaltenbrunner tried to contact the Americans because he had these plans to make a separate peace with the Americans.
But when his overtures of negotiation were rejected, Kaltenbrunner fled, but not before burying his loot.
When Kaltenbrunner finally left the Salzkammergut and tried to flee, what he left behind and what was found was gold in his garden. He just simply took cases full of gold and hid them in his garden, and those were dug up in the first weeks after the war.
But it wasn't just Kaltenbrunner burying gold. In the south of Austria, American GIs uncovered over 700 Nazi gold bars buried in a shallow hole in the ground. And the stories of hidden Nazi gold started to percolate throughout the Salzkammergut.
There is eyewitnesses telling you about famous Nazis, just like Heinrich Himmler, the head of the Gestapo, coming here in the final days of the war, riding into the Salzkammergut, together with about 15 officers on motor cars with sidecars, and that they were full of cases with valuables and gold. And they went up to the mountains and didn't come back.
But the majority of the rumors centered on one lake. The same lake that Ida Weisenbacher had witnessed boxes being thrown into. Lake Toplitz.
Toplitz is an absolutely fascinating geological phenomenon. It's a long lake. It's a ravine that's filled in as deep as Big Ben, several hundred feet.
The Nazis knew all about Lake Toplitz. Joseph Goebbels' holiday villa was close by. Because of its 103-meter depth and remote location, from 1943, it had been used as a naval testing station. In its dark waters, the Nazis experimented with underwater explosives and submarines, testing them at different depths. They fired torpedoes from underwater into the lakeside mountain, gouging out large cavities in its canyon walls.
The Germans used it to test new submarine missiles. They tested a submarine missile that eventually became the Polaris missile. So there's a lot of junk at the bottom of that lake. Used ammunition, God knows what.
Lake Toplitz was seen by SS Command as an ideal place to sink the Nazi horde and stop the Allies getting their hands on it. And one day, when things improved, they would return and retrieve it. Eyewitness Ida Weisenbacher still lives just a couple of miles from Lake Toplitz and remembers the day the SS arrived. It's the same house she lived in as a young girl when she was ordered to help them transport heavy boxes to the lake.
I said, are you crazy? Why would you throw them in the lake? No, they had to go in. There was something that didn't belong here anymore.
But precisely what was in the heavy boxes, she did not know. Could they have contained the missing Nazi gold? A week after the SS dumped their load into Lake Toplitz, on the 8th of May 1945, the Nazis surrendered. The Allied nations celebrated victory. But where was all the missing Nazi gold? After the war, as the years went by, the stories of what was thrown into Lake Toplitz grew and grew. Because of what Ida had seen and the reports of buried gold being dug up, everyone seemed to be convinced that there must be gold lying at the bottom of the lake. In the 1950s, local boy Gerhard Zauner grew up on the stories of buried treasure in Toplitz.
As children, we discovered a lot of things that were thrown into the lake after the war. I went to these places hundreds of times, and with your fingers, you go through the silt. Over here, one Nazi bigwig lived, and over there another, and in the lakes they lived next to, you could find things.
In the post-war years, amateur divers attempted to reach the bed of Lake Toplitz to recover its Nazi treasure. But Toplitz is a highly unusual lake. No oxygen exists below 20 meters, so nothing perishes. With its steep, wooded banks, trees fall in and form a false bottom of floating logs, under which, if you get trapped, there's often no way back to the surface. Two German scientists who had worked in the Nazis' naval station during the war drowned when they attempted to get to the bottom of Toplitz. Their deaths only heightened the rumors of what was hidden in the lake. Only now, people said the lake was cursed. In the late 1950s, the stories of gold dumped into Lake Toplitz proved irresistible to one journalist. Working at Germany's biggest-selling magazine, Der Stern, investigative reporter Wolfgang Loerde had reached the top of his profession.
In those days, you always had to be there first and come back with a picture and a story for the magazine. And it was tough having to be the first all the time. It wears you out. I even had a plane at my disposal.
Loerder painstakingly pieced together the story of what happened at Lake Toplitz, collating information gleaned from Nazi documents, local rumors, and even the confessions of former Nazi generals in South America.
At first, I didn't know anything about the cult. I only stumbled upon it when I did some research afterwards into how things had happened.
Based on what he'd discovered, Loerder persuaded his editors to finance the first large-scale exploration of Toplitz, on the grounds that he might just get the scoop of the decade. And it helped that Wolfgang Loerder wasn't just a journalist.
I was in the Navy. I was a naval officer during the war. So, I know how to operate underwater.
Toplitz is fed from a smaller lake above and feeds into a larger lake below, which gives it a sequence of unique but dangerous currents. Loerder had to establish exactly how he could navigate the precarious movements of the lake all the way to the bottom, 103 meters down.
I had to calculate with what speed and at what level the lake would move. I did that in the winter of '58 for the first time. The lake was still frozen and was just starting to melt. And this way you can see exactly how the streams from Toplitz develop.
And even if he managed to work out the currents, getting whatever was down there to the surface presented a whole other set of problems. Loerder adapted technology he had used in the Marines.
I did the calculations and then we built ourselves a claw gripper. We had built the gripper in such a way that it opens when it goes down. And then a rope had to be pulled, so it closes when it is down. And when it was closed, we would pull the box up. You learn a lot in the Navy.
De Stern commissioned a fleet of VW Dormobiles to transport Loerder and his team of divers, photographers, and writers to Austria. But it was very much Loerder's story. He would lead the exploration and write daily reports as he went. Loerder attached to the claw gripper lights and a camera, which would relay pictures to the crew on the surface. With the information he had acquired from locals and former Nazis, Loerder had a good idea where the suspected gold had been sunk.
Using my calculations, we eased down the claw gripper, down to the 100 meters depth of the lake.
They scanned the entire lake for 2 weeks and found nothing. But Loerder was determined, and just when they were ready to give up, told his team they had to continue into the darkness.
We searched some more at night, with the camera on the bed of the lake. In the beginning, we didn't find anything. But then through the cable on the monitor, I could see there is something there. At about 11 at night, we saw a box.
Loerder's team could barely contain their excitement. Had they found the missing Nazi gold?
The camera lit up the box. Then the claw gripper came and it picked it up. When it was 2-3 meters from the surface, I stopped. Otherwise, the box would have burst open.
If they dropped the box, Loerde's story would sink with it. He wasn't going to take that risk.
I dived in, tied some rope underwater, and wrapped it around the box. Then I resurfaced and gave them the rope.
But when they brought the box to the surface, no one was sure what was inside. The next morning, the world's media waited with bated breath. Amongst the crowd was local boy Gerhard Zauner, who still remembers the day that changed his life.
For us, it was sensational. We all went to Lake Toplitz with our parents to witness the salvation of this treasure. This was a big motivation for me. I had to get down there.
But it wasn't just Zauner and his family who were on tenterhooks to see what was in Loerde's recovered box.
The police came and the public. 80 or 90 people. It was a scrum. Then we pulled the box up. The box burst open. But there wasn't any gold in there.
To the crowd's astonishment, the Stern team hadn't found gold, but millions and millions of pristine British banknotes.
We brought them up, and after 16 or 17 boxes, we thought, this is nonsense. We leave them all down there and tear the lids open underwater, and then we can see if it is gold or... But they were just notes.
It was the beginning of a whole new mystery. What were these pounds? And why had they been sunk in Lake Toplitz? The mystery deepened when it was revealed the pounds weren't quite what they seemed.
Lake Toplitz in Austria, and the end of a long search which for years puzzled Scotland Yard and the international police. Down there at the bottom of the lake are boxes of printing plates and notes, the clue to what must be the biggest forgery of all time.
What Loerde and his De Stern team had discovered wasn't gold, but 73 million pounds worth of perfectly forged banknotes. The equivalent of almost 3 billion pounds in today's money. Just why they were there, nobody knew. But unraveling the mystery of the counterfeit pounds would make Wolfgang Loerde's name.
Loerde was consumed by this the way almost anybody who gets involved with it does. It was a tremendous sensation. He got a lot of publicity and a lot of very good stories.
Over 15 editions, De Stern slowly unpicked the truth behind the mystery of Lake Toplitz. What Loerde had found was evidence of the biggest counterfeiting operation in history.
The idea of counterfeiting British pounds was actually conceived in the first week of the war.
The Nazis' plan was to destabilize the pound as the world's reserve currency and bring the British Empire to its knees. Great Britain would be subsumed into the 1,000-year Reich. The Bank of England was convinced its banknotes were unforgeable. But the German SS had other ideas. Its head, Heinrich Himmler, was in charge of the plan. And he had just the person to put it into practice. An SS officer with a background in engineering and a speciality in forging passports had come to Himmler's attention. His name was Bernhard Kruger. Himmler told Kruger he would even name the operation after him, Operation Bernhard. It was an offer Kruger couldn't refuse. Kruger was instructed by Himmler to use Jewish counterfeiters and artists to make his pounds. Many of them were already at the Nazis' disposal.
Kruger went to Auschwitz saying, please have everybody, any one of your Jewish prisoners who speaks German and is connected with the graphic arts, just pull their names out and get them ready. And he assembled, over a period of about a year or two, 140 Jewish prisoners in the Sachsenhausen concentration camp just north of Berlin, which was actually the headquarters of all the concentration camps.
Kruger then had to decide which pound note was the easiest for his Sachsenhausen team to forge.
They decided to print 5-pound notes. Big, impressive 5-pound notes, black and white notes, easy to print. This man was a very meticulous engineer by training, and he got plates that were sent by the Reichsbank's engravers, and they adjusted these plates with all of the special secret markings that the British put on the pounds.
They wanted to make really perfect pound notes. Those pound notes, of course, were part of their plans. They were supposed to be used for international finance.
Wolfgang Loeder's De Stern articles revealed that in September 1942, the first Sachsenhausen-produced forged pounds had made their way into circulation over the Channel. They were technically brilliant, almost undetectable. The Bank of England declared them the most dangerous forgeries they'd ever seen. Soon, a flood of forged pounds were appearing, used by the Nazis to buy weapons and yet more gold. The Nazi plan was working. Sterling began to lose value. But Himmler and the SS had bigger ideas.
They came up with this crazy idea that if they print millions of fake pounds and drop them over England, that the British economy would just blow up and collapse.
Himmler wanted Goering's Luftwaffe to airdrop the forgeries over Britain, rendering the pound worthless. They certainly had enough forgeries. Between 1942 and 1945, the Sachsenhausen counterfeiters produced 134 million fake pounds.
That represents roughly 13% of the billion pounds in circulation throughout the world.
The pound was becoming a suspect currency. Nobody knew which were real and which were the Führer's forgeries.
This was the greatest counterfeit in history. Captain Kruger, who was in charge of this, boasted quite correctly after the war, I am the greatest counterfeiter in history, which he was. There's nothing even near it.
But Himmler's idea of a huge airdrop was never realized. The Germans were losing the war. The Luftwaffe simply didn't have enough planes to put the idea into practice. As the Allies approached in 1945, Krüger knew his life and that of his counterfeiters had little meaning to his boss, Heinrich Himmler, who was desperately trying to hide evidence of his appalling crimes.
Krüger realized that not only when the thing was shut down that the Jews would get killed, but he, as the bearer of a state secret, probably would get killed too. So it was the interests of both the SS major and the Jews began to converge.
Krüger ordered his men to escape and burn all the evidence of his extraordinary counterfeiting operation. The trouble was, burning millions of pounds was more difficult than Krüger realized.
Why didn't they just destroy them? The point is, they did try to destroy a number of them. They had orders to burn them and leave not a trace of any pound in the ashes. And they buried the ashes.
But there were just too many pounds to destroy. So Krüger sent a unit with forgeries boxed in weighted, waterproof crates, each weighing 200 pounds, to the Salzkammergut. Their destination was Lake Toplitz, as proved by Wolfgang Loerder, who pulled them to the surface in 1959.
The intelligence service of the SS, in cahoots with high-level experts, brought the boxes to the Toplitz in Austria. I knew that the boxes were thrown into Toplitz, and I knew who threw them in.
Loerder revealed that the SS unit were told very specifically to attempt to find a way of retrieving the boxes after the war.
They take the coffins full of counterfeit pounds and they sink them in the lake, but not completely, because each one of those coffins is attached to a rope.
Und dann wurden diese Kisten. These boxes were tied up to wooden floats with a rope and thrown into the water.
Und ins Wasser geschmissen. Und ein Bild ist auch da.
And in one of the pictures, a little boy, my son, is pulling the float with a rope attached to it.
The ropes from the boxes were attached to logs that would float and indicate where they had been sunk. That way, the SS believed they would one day return and reclaim their sunken loot. Once Loerder had discovered the truth, the Austrian government, on instructions from the Bank of England, destroyed Krüger's pounds. But such was the scale of the counterfeiting operation. Today, there are almost 3 times more counterfeits than originals left in existence.
To me, the profound irony of the pounds is that the real fakes, and there are some fake fakes actually, that is people trying to cash in on it, the real fakes which fetch 10s, 20s, 30s, 50 pounds, far more valuable than their face value, sometimes 100 pounds if they're good ones in good condition.
But had Wolfgang Loerder unraveled the mystery of Lake Toplitz once and for all? Were the stories of sunken gold just stories after all? Questions remained. If Toplitz only contained forged pounds, what was in the heavier boxes, as seen by Ida Weisenbacher that day the SS arrived at her door? Could they have contained gold?
Stimmt. Absolutely, absolutely. All these boxes haven't been taken out. I'm convinced. There were these small, heavy boxes with the handles. I don't know, but maybe there was gold in there. The gold must be really deep down.
It's not such a far-fetched idea. Even the man who found the forged pounds in Lake Toplitz is convinced another unit of SS officers were responsible for the disposal of Nazi gold.
There was a different group that transported boxes with gold to Austria. There are probably gold boxes down there. They're still there. The place can still be found today. I can even show you on a photo.
Loerder's convinced this photograph, taken by a naval officer at the time, shows pounds being thrown into the lake in the foreground, but gold being sunk in the back. The rumors of sunken gold remain so strong that in 1963, 4 years after de Stern's revelations, a young diver from Munich drowned looking for it. Whilst searching for the body, the Austrian government mounted the first official exploration of the lake. They pulled to the surface equipment from Sachsenhausen and yet more counterfeit pounds, but no gold. After that, the authorities introduced a ban on all underwater explorations of Toplitz, which still exists today. But that didn't stop one man, Gerhard Zauner, who as a boy had witnessed Wolfgang Loerder raising the forged pounds from the depths all those years ago.
It is my world. It is my favorite lake because historically it's the hottest.
Zauner has dived for gold and other treasures more times than anyone else in the Salzkammergut. He's pulled so much Nazi memorabilia from the bottom of the Austrian lakes, he's even opened his own museum.
We've had bayonets, rifles, handguns, hypodermic needles, 3 big round mines. One of them is in the restaurant at Toplitz.
But Zauner never discovered gold until 1987. On the 1st of April, Zauner pulled from the depths 14 perfectly preserved gold bars. Gerhard Zauner, the local dive enthusiast, had raised the Nazi gold. Finally, someone had found it. But all was not as it seemed.
We had a very unpleasant policeman who examined my car's tires. They were worn out. He made me pay the maximum fine. But he was actually right. And we thought,
We were going to do a prank on him. So we had gold bars made, and we sank them.
Und die haben wir dann versenkt. It was all just an April Fool's joke by Zauner to get back at his local policeman.
We said it wasn't gold, but the police said it was, as it was heavy. They took it away, and after 3 days they found out it wasn't gold after all.
Dass es kein Gold ist.
No one knows the policeman's real name now. Everyone just calls him Goldfinger.
Even today, Zauner's hoax hasn't stopped the stories of Nazi gold in Lake Toplitz from persisting.
There are so many funny stories the Austrians tell about it, because they say there's all these nutty Americans and British coming to Lake Toplitz, and we're just making jokes with them.
Any story that says, look, there's gold in them thar hills or them thar lakes is going to attract people who'll say, let me go after it and look for it. Because after all, if you find it, you've hit the jackpot.
The mystery of what really lies at the bottom of the devil's dustbin may never be solved.
Today, Toplitz is a bit of a secret. It doesn't want to show all it's got, does it?
One thing is for sure, there's large amounts of gold and other valuables in the Salzkammergut that have not been found.